Good morning, everyone. This is a 1-minute cue. We're going to get started in about a little bit less than 1 minute. This is George Sugai from the University of Connecticut and the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. So like I said, we're going to get started in about 30 seconds now, and I'll come back on and we'll start the webcast. All right, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. It is 11 o'clock on the eastern side and 8 o'clock on the Pacific Coast side. Really do appreciate everyone who's participating in this webinar. I am George Sugai. I'm at the University of Connecticut, and I work with the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. And we're working collaboratively with the special ed programs and also Safe and Healthy Students offices in the Department of Education. And this is our third webinar in our series supporting the school climate transformation grants and the PBIS effort that's being supported by the Department of Education. And really do appreciate your participation in this particular conference, webinar, excuse me. Ivan will be in the background. He's our technical assistance person, and he may come in occasionally if needed. But I think we're pretty well set to go. And I will be in control of the PowerPoint, and I'm going to walk you through some content for the next hour or so, and I'll give you the agenda for that in a few seconds. So again, thank you very much for getting on the call. I just want to acknowledge that all the webinars that have already occurred, as well as future webinars, are listed at pbis.org. And in particular, if you go to presentations and or to the School Climate Transformation click, you'll be able to look at previous webinars as well as seeing the PowerPoints, as well as future presentations as well. We encourage you to put those onto your calendars. You'll also receive notices from your project officers and also from any coordinators that you are collaborating with. The National PBIS website is supported by the Office of Safe and Healthy Students as well as the Office of Special Ed Programs. And it's a pretty rich source for information for supporting the activities that we're going to walk through in this brief period for this leadership teaming presentation. I also want to indicate that Heather George from the University of South Florida was planning to be on this call, but she has been sick with a bug for the last 24 hours and is unable to participate. So I will walk us through the complete webinar, and hopefully I will represent the content that Heather was also going to describe. I'll present her email address at the very end as well, so if you would like to get in touch with her, you're welcome to do that. So again, because of the short amount of time, and I want to make sure that we have some minutes at the end of the webinar for answering some questions, which I would encourage you to put into the question window on your screen if you're watching. What I'll do is review those towards the end, and we'll pick 2 or 3 of those to have a conversation. And so if you click on the questions window, you'll see a location there where you can write your question as well as indicate who you are, so I'll be able to respond to those. The purpose of this webinar is to spend a little bit of time describing the role of leadership, in particular leadership teaming, within the context of building your capacity to build and implement multi-tiered behavior frameworks. The goal is to describe the features, the qualities, and functions of leadership teaming in support of your efforts to put your grant activities in place, as well as your evaluation activities, as well as your implementation strategies and so forth. We're going to provide you with information that will cover the full range of from new content as well as some developing materials, as well as some things that are currently in place. We acknowledge that some of you are brand new to this process of multi-tiered behavior frameworks as well as PBIS or any other kinds of practices and innovations you're putting in place. And some of you probably could do this presentation as well as I could. My goal is to try to provide you with at least some highlights of key features or core features, as well as some of the lessons learned that we've accumulated over the 14 or 15 years at the PBIS Center and in our collaborations with the Office of Safe and Healthy Students. I do want to acknowledge that the project officers for Safe and Healthy Students are available to you if you have follow-up questions, as well as any of the PBIS coordinators or collaborators you've been working with. Okay, so to get a start here, I want to spend the first 10 or 15 minutes doing what I like to call sort of the basics. And the goal here is to really show you how leadership is contextualized and fit into the implementation efforts that you are doing now with your school climate transformation grants. As many of you know, the effort that we're putting in place is all about building capacity, and that capacity is about making sure we select and put in place the best evidence-based practices to maximize kid benefit as well as family benefit. We really do believe that quality leadership is all about trying to put in place effective organizations and supporting the implementation of those organizations. And we like to define those as being organizations that have a common language, common picture or vision about where they want to go, and a common experience or routine for those participants in that organization. This session, this webinar, is all about quality leadership, and the end goal, of course, is to create these effective organizations. And Heather and I put together these materials as a way to help you think about some of the things we've learned from our implementers about what leadership can look like, how it functions, and some of the things you might invest in as you move forward. It's really important for us to remember that organizations aren't what we're trying to change, but we're really trying to organize environments so that the members of the organization can be successful in implementing the activities and so forth that you have in place within your grants. So it really is about trying to create an environment where people within the organization are really moving towards this common goal and towards a common outcome. And that will help us kind of think about the functions that we engage in and how we organize leadership teaming, and the functions of leadership. So quality leadership is core to what we're up to, and it's going to be something that will drive much of what you've already been doing as well as what you have been doing. I'm going to try to answer 3 questions as we go through this, and one is, again, how does teaming relate to the multi-tiered behavior framework work that you're doing now and some of the activities within your grants? Second thing is, what do effective teams do? And that's sort of the implementation strategies that I think are important for us to put in place as we're thinking about school, district, and state level implementation. And then at the very end, we'll leave some time for Q&A, like I mentioned, but also we'll give you some thoughts about what to do next with this content. All right. So the goal here is to make sure that we understand how the multi-tiered behavior framework fits. And I want to show you a little bit about some of the context in which this occurs. And I just happened to notice on the question thing that somebody was asking about, are we going to share these slides? And the answer is absolutely yes. You can actually find them on the PBS website. You can also get them through any of us that are supporting you. When we think about leadership, we think about organizations, and what we find is many organizations are not organized for success. In this particular organization, they're really trying to improve school climate, like many of us on this call are trying to do. But what we find is that there are many other initiatives going on at the same time, many of them having similar goals and outcomes, and some of them are actually overlapping, and many of them aren't even talking with each other. We want to argue that leadership is one of the most important elements to try to unravel that kind of mess on the right-hand side of that slide so that we can have an effective organization to use those practices well. One way to think about leadership is to understand that much of the literature that's out there suggests that leadership is core to maximizing student benefit. But one of the things that's important to us about leadership functions is to know that school leaders, school leadership teams, school leadership structures don't have a direct impact on student learning. But the major lines of impacting student learning have to do with school climate, teacher quality, teacher preparation, predispositions, as well as classroom conditions. So one of the things you're going to hear as we go through the rest of the morning is this notion that school leadership is really about making sure that the school conditions, and I like to call those school climate, classroom conditions, classroom climate, and teachers' quality, skills, opportunities are aligned to, or maximized to achieve student outcomes. We acknowledge that kids come to school with backgrounds that affect their ability to benefit, but what's really important here is that school leadership has the most impact on those things that are indicated in green on the screen, which is school conditions, teachers, and classrooms. Now, I want you to notice on the left-hand side that we have state leadership, federal policy, state district leadership, and so forth, professional development policies, and so forth, that are available to schools, but that always funnels through school leadership. And again, I'm not trying to emphasize that school leadership is sort of central to the impact of best practices on student learning, but action planning has to occur in the context of school, school, classroom, and teacher. Many of you have seen and know about this, especially if you participated in the webinars that we've had in the past, or if you've participated in the orientation we had last October in Chicago. But I just want us to be very clear that PBIS, multi-tier behavior frameworks, things that you're doing in your particular settings, isn't really so focused so much on the practices as much as they are how we organize those practices. And because of that, we're really focusing on building a framework that helps us organize those practices into a continuum, allows us to maximize academic and behavioral outcomes, and really for all students. But in particular, many of you, as you would know, kids with disabilities, kids of color, kids who have risk factors are all part of this process.
George?
Continuum? Yes,
George,
sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're not seeing your slides, your slideshow progress.
Really? So what are you seeing right now?
We are just seeing the main slide, the primer on developing state and district leadership teaming capacity slide.
Well,
if you click the drop down underneath the show my screen, it'll highlight the element of the screen that you want to see or that you want to share.
Yeah, let's see now. I apologize for that. Stop show, record. I don't see the show my screen option here. Oh wait, maybe it's here. That's not it. Sorry about that, Ivan. I'm not sure what I should be pushing. Oh, I see. What I see on my screen is a screen sharing and it says paused, but I don't know how to unpause that.
Click on the pause button and see whether you can unpause it that way.
All my pauses are not working. It's ringing.
Let me take the presenter role back, and then if you would just minimize all your applications to just show the PowerPoint, and then I'll give you back presenter role, and we'll try and share it that way.
Okay.
Sorry, audience, if you just bear with us, please.
Okay, Ivan, what do you see?
I'm going to give presenter role back.
Show my screen.
Okay.
Let me start broadcast as well?
No, we have the broadcast started. If you'll go ahead and go back to the slideshow mode. There we go. And now we are seeing the continuum of support for all.
Well done, Ivan.
Well, thank you, George.
Okay. So I assume we're back onto the group?
Yes, we are.
Great. Thank you very much. Sorry about that pause. That was my fault. Looks like I had a wrong button pushed. And that explains why I really couldn't see my slides. So instead, I won't start over again, but I'll have you guys kind of go back and kind of reference those materials. You'll also be able to see this on the recorded version of this as well. What I was getting at there is that the PBIS framework is the context in which leadership occurs. And this leadership, as many of you know, is based on this logic of a continuum. It's a three-tiered logic. And again, it's about making sure that the frameworks that we put in place, as well as the capacity you're establishing, is building something in place for everybody with also a linkage to those supports that are required for kids who need a little extra. So the next picture then says, well, if we really do believe the continuum is important for leaderships to pay attention to, then what are the core sort of elements that make up this framework? And many, again, have seen these elements before, universal screening and progress monitoring and so forth. But what I wanted to highlight there is that the team-based implementation component is essential to this multi-tiered systems logic, which is why, again, that the Office of Safe and Healthy Students, as well as special ed programs, said it's really important to have a webinar that focuses on team-based implementation. We really like to emphasize that the team operates around 4 essential elements. In the past, many teams would only focus on practices, and what we've argued then is that we've really got to do a balance between making sure that we use information, which is data, to be able to define the outcomes, systems, and practices that are part of what the leadership team builds into their action planning. What we've learned is that the best evidence-based practices don't go anywhere if the systems, which is what the adults need to have to be able to implement those practices, aren't in place. So when we get towards the end, you'll notice that I'm going to emphasize, or we're going to emphasize, that leadership teams make sure that their action plans have elements that touch upon clarity about outcomes, use of information for decision making, the best evidence-based practices, and the staff preparation for the use of those practices. Also, I want you to understand again that we have this implementation kind of logic that's in place, and much of the action planning that I just referenced is linked to what we call implementation drivers. What's most important to me about this process is for you to notice the yellow oval in the middle, now that you can see the screen, that talks about leadership team. It is central to the action planning process. It is central to being able to define and being able to implement those drivers that actually affect how schools implement or districts implement, as well as the impact on kids. What you should understand about these drivers along the top is that those drivers represent the components that address how to put in place the best supports for the adults in order for them to be able to put these practices in place. The third row down, the green box, is actually represent the activities we engage in as a leadership team to maximize the impact or fidelity of implementation at the school level. Professional development has to do with training, coaching has to do with kind of the supports that are in place for the teams, the performance feedback has to do with information that's used for decision making, and then the content expertise, which is really important to us, is how do we make sure that the implementation expertise is located at the local level and not by outside external supports that may not be sustainable over time. To show this in one other way, just to show you again how leadership is related to the implementation effort, this picture represents the relationship between action planning at different levels and student benefit at the end. I wanted you to particularly to notice that those arrows represent coaching, and coaching represents how do we make sure that what happens during training transfers to the next level. Because what's in place there are these 3 leadership teams, and these 3 teams, state SEA, district LEA, school teams, and then staff within the school, those leadership teams actually develop and then implement those action plans in a way that guides the process towards student benefit. Again, what's most important about this picture in the multi-tiered behavior framework is that leadership teaming is actually the lever, the tool, the component or element that it holds this together, that allows the flow between the action planning, data, practice, and systems, and the transfer of that implementation over to students. So to kind of bring all that last 10 minutes together, 15 minutes together into one picture, what it represents is the following. What we're doing in this school climate transformation grants is really focused on trying to improve student outcomes. How do we decrease the amount of kids who are leaving school? How do we decrease the amount of substance use? How do we decrease the amount of kids who are being suspended or expelled? How do we increase the amount of kids who attend, show up on time? We really do believe it's important to have data, systems, and practices, information, interventions, and supports for the adults in place. And those have to be ones that are effective, efficient, and relevant, meaning that they work, they're doable, and they're actually culturally relevant to the context in which they're being applied. To make that work, you've got to have these drivers. Those drivers are training, coaching, and evaluation, and combined, when taken into consideration the local context, cultural considerations, we can improve the fidelity of implementation, which again improves those student outcomes. This is all how the leadership team operates. It operates with those core features and elements together in order to maximize the student outcomes. So what I want to do next is, in the remaining 15 or 20 minutes or so, highlight some of the actions that teams can engage in, some of the strategies and self-assessments that could support this logic and the importance of teaming. I'm going to focus on how the multi-tier behavior framework serves as a context for coordinating the implementation of the PBS multi-tier behavior framework system, as well as the role of leadership. And again, this is focusing on leadership, and as you'll learn from other webinars, there are other important elements like evaluation and so forth. But the goal here is to focus on leadership teaming as the place where the action is, and try to make this all work. So one of the first tasks that I'm going to give you to think about is, how do we make a decision as a leadership team to decide what our priorities are going to be and how we're going to make decisions about building our action plans. One thing we've learned from a number of different projects, the CSIP project, from Karen Blasi and Dean Fixon and others, is that the goal here is to think about maximizing the integration and alignment of all systems and the importance of the leadership teams making that a priority. Many initiatives fail because there's a lack of attention to this notion about integration and alignment. This alignment issue becomes important because we know that implementation is going to be linked to leadership efforts, and the leadership team has this big priority represented by those four green circles, in being clear about how they make selections of the interventions, the practices, and the data. But it really gets to be transferred into the implementation part, which is those pink circles, about how do we arrange for fidelity, how do we arrange for continuous implementation, and how do we make sure that that implementation is actually achieving the outcomes we want. That leadership team, excuse me, is central to any school, district, or state implementation. So what I wanted to move to, though, is what are those critical functions? And what Heather George did and others, which is really kind of neat, is said, you know what, these functions are kind of located in specific domains. And if you think about what you're doing now in your LEA level leadership team, or in your state level team, or in your grant coordination team, I'm hoping that you have, that you're paying attention, if you will, or giving adequate amount of time and energy towards using information to guide decision making, which is the data part, having a very concrete and doable action plan that serves as a blueprint for your effort, making sure that you know that policy development is going to be part of making sure you institutionalize and sustain this work, also making sure that professional development becomes something that can be integrated into the ongoing operation of your organization, because without professional development, you're not going to be able to make sure that you have high levels of competent work implementation staff. And then lastly, is this really being coordinated up and down through the school, district, state, and federal levels. What we've learned, again, is these team functioning areas aren't adequately covered. We get sort of siloed, and we find that we're not able to achieve the kinds of outcomes that are the most important. Another way to think about this, and many of you have seen this picture before, to illustrate the process by which a team operates, and I'm less concerned about you knowing what's inside those circles, but most concerned that you understand that the team and the agreement circle are prerequisites for the implementation, which is the green circles. We have learned that if you do not have commitment, if you haven't established commitment, if you haven't organized your action plan so that commitment is more likely and agreements are established, that the implementation oftentimes is not done at high levels of fidelity or not implemented at a level that produces the impact that we want. So it's really important for leadership teams to invest in having a team that functions well, which is where I'm headed next, and that has the ability to make agreements about what's going to be implemented and establishing agreements by those who are implementing. It's really important that you not push for implementation until the agreements are established. All right, so let me give you some examples of things that you can walk away with, that you can look up. And I'm going to go through a couple of these in a little bit more detail more towards the end. But there are many, many examples out there from Florida, Missouri, Illinois, Colorado, Wisconsin, and so forth and so on. Many, many examples available at multi-tiered system sites as well as at PBIS sites and RTI sites and so forth. But one thing people have learned across districts and states, it's really important to formalize the readiness requirements and process. What you'll see on this particular page is this effort by the Florida Positive Behavioral Support Project to operationalize what's most important in putting in place an implementation team and a leadership team at the district level. And there are a whole list or a whole collection of items that have proven to be essential to check for readiness on the implementation effort at the district level. We have similar checklists. This is also from Florida system, but you can also find from many other districts around the country as well. School readiness implementation checklists that indicate what are the school's requirements for participation in the implementation of an effort at the district level. We also, I should mention, have state-level readiness checklists as well. Say, are we ready as a state to be able to transfer initiatives, policies, and programs to districts, and districts to schools, and schools down to the classroom. What's most important about these is probably not so much the range of examples within, but just the fact that it's been formalized and that it requires a self-assessment and a commitment to a set of activities that support the implementation. In this particular example on the right-hand side, you'll see that there are sign-offs for principals, sign-offs on others for superintendents, for supervisors, just to formalize the commitment. Because we've learned that unless that's in place, we lose our ability to have the readiness features in place for full implementation. To think about the leadership role in a different way, and this particular picture shows some sort of functions, if you will, or characteristics of effective principals. Randy Sprick and Jeff Colvin wrote a really cool paper in 1999 in which they identified what are the leadership roles of school principals, and I'd argue that transfer over to superintendents as well as to program leads as well as to grant monitors and so forth. But what we found is that the literature is pretty clear about some of those things that characterize effective leaders. And again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on going through each one of these, but instead does it recognize that we all in leadership functions or roles should be paying attention to the things that we can do that have the biggest effect. And there are a few things that have much more sizable impact on our implementation than others. Because we know that teams need time and resources. We know that teams have to implement and reinforce those individuals who are implementing with fidelity. So again, I want you to be aware of some pretty good ideas about what effective leaders within leadership teams, within leadership distributions can do. Now, one other thing I want to point out, and this is just one example, and another thing for you to walk away with as a homework task, and I showed you the slide earlier, or the picture earlier, of multiple activities and initiatives going on, and the inability to implement any one of them because so much energy is going into trying to herd all of those initiatives under one organizational umbrella. A number of states, a number of school districts have been working on developing tools that allow them to be able to make decisions about what to eliminate, what to keep, what to merge, what to downsize, what to upsize, and so forth. What we've learned is that it's very difficult to do it without some kind of structure. This is sometimes called working smarter charts. This is sometimes called teaming audits or committee audits. Sometimes it's called resource mapping. I want to show you a couple of examples just to highlight how the process works so that you yourselves can do this on your own committee structures as well as helping those that are trying to develop their leadership teams. This example is one that's been we've used a number of years in the PBS Center. Came out of some work that was done in Hawaii, has been widely adapted around the country. Key features of this particular sheet indicates on the left-hand side which are all the committees that have anything to do with behavior. And then across the top are some ways to characterize each of those committees. So for example, what is the purpose, what's the outcome, what is the target group or recipients of that team's effort, who are the staff involved on that team, and how does it relate to school improvement plans. And you could modify that based on what's most important for your particular organization. But one column you cannot forget is the outcome column. And we use that as one of our first elements or criterion for deciding how to evaluate a particular committee. And let me quickly show you what this looks like. This is one that's been completed, sort of an exemplar for this particular demonstration. And I want you to highlight again the outcome column. And what you'll notice in the outcome column is that what we look for are outcomes that are measurable. And one of our first steps is that your outcome has to be measurable in order to guide your implementation, the leadership team's efforts. And what that means, again, is making sure that you know where you're headed. And if you can't make that clear, then you really have to question the value of the effort for that particular team. In this particular example, there are 3 committees that are being questioned: the Improved Character, the Character Ed Committee, the School Spirit Committee, and the DARE Committee. And the primary discussion is around where are we headed. The DARE Committee, you'll notice, has no outcome that they've specified, and you want to make sure that you have something that guides so you'll know whether or not you're getting there or not. Improve morale isn't sufficiently defined in a way that's measurable. Is that going to be based on student surveys? Is that going to be based on interviews? Is that going to be based on discipline referrals? How is that going to be measured? And because without that, it's really important. It makes it very much more difficult for being able to make decisions about what to keep and what to invest in. And we would argue that if you don't know where you're going, you really want to put in place something that is clear and important to the particular school. Here's another example of another version of the same thing, of resource mapping, called the Building Team Audit. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's some guidance on about how to evaluate the mission, how it relates to the mission of the school, and also to what degree is that particular committee a priority. But to answer those 2 questions, you're oftentimes looking at the purpose, expected outcome, target group, and membership. These are all available to you at your state PBS or multi-tiered systems site. They're also available at the School Climate Transformation Click at pbs.org. The Building Team Audit has a set of questions that you can organize your meeting around, which allows you to make some decisions in a systematic way so it isn't random, and it allows everybody to have a voice in the process. And in the end, the goal is to be able to describe at the school, district, or state level what your investments are. This is just an example of one school, only an example. This does not represent what everybody has to do, but instead an example. But in this particular school, at the primary tier level, these are the investments that are being made based on their resource mapping audit. At the secondary tier, these are what the small group supports look like, and at the tertiary level, these are what the individual supports look like. The big idea here, though, is that you've got a continuum of supports that was driven by the leadership team's audit or resource mapping in order to decide. We would love to see the same kind of continuum being developed at the district level. What are your initiatives that are focused on all kids, primary? What are your initiatives for individual kids, tertiary? And how do those map in? Again, it's not so important about, if you pick a particular curriculum, but can you justify and demonstrate where it fits into the particular process? All right. So a couple more things I want to cover before we end and move into questions. So make sure that if you have questions that you locate them on the questions window, and I'll quickly try to scan those as we move into the question time in about 12 minutes or so. But what I wanted you to remember also that as you do this resource mapping task, one of the things to keep in mind is that we can pick these effective interventions that have high priority, but it's really important that we organize our resources in a way that allows us to implement with the highest degree of fidelity. The School Climate Transformation Grant folks clearly have invested in the idea of evidence-based practices. I mean, that's an important part of what we do. However, it is not going to be very effective if we're not implementing with the highest degree of fidelity. So I just want to remind the leadership teams that one of the goals, in addition to student benefit, is making sure that we maximize the fidelity of the implementation of the practice. But again, it requires us to make sure that we're organizing our resources in a manner that allows that to happen. All right, so to go back and go back to one of the other checklists that I mentioned earlier, just to give you a glimpse about what those look like. Again, this is the district readiness list. And what I wanted to point out to you is that you'll notice that it's built around the implementation drivers that were mentioned in the previous implementation blueprint, around demonstrations, political support, visibility, and funding. Again, these are just guides for being able to look at our readiness to be able to put in place an action plan that supports the school climate transformation grant activities that you have in place. Whatever your intervention is fine, but do you have a training system in place that allows you to not only implement during the grant period, but also to implement when the grant period ends? Do you have coaching support that allows the training that occurs to be transferred to the classroom, school, or district? Same thing is true of evaluation. One of the previous webinars was on evaluation, and it covered the whole notion about why data are so important for decision making, and that's also part of district readiness as well. To quickly go through the school readiness version, same kind of idea. What you'll see again is this notion that we focus on the same critical areas: political support, funding, visibility, training, and evaluation. Again, noticing that we're focusing on making sure there's a commitment or agreements for participation. We're asking people to sign off. Again, what I wanted to highlight there is that the process is about establishing readiness. It's about self-assessment. What's most important to us is that the core elements are represented in that process. As a leadership team, really, really important that you establish an action plan. This is one example from, again, Florida. Heather presented this one. It's a really cool way to think about action planning. And on the left-hand side, you have an idea about where you want to go, what your vision is, sort of self-identified, what are some of the challenges that you need to keep in mind. But most importantly, there's strengths and resources and the action plan that goes there. You'll again see the drivers that are associated with implementation. Next steps, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 20 years. The idea, again, is to be thoughtful about where you're headed so that you can organize your resources. And again, you'll have a chance to look at this when you're on your own, but you can see one example of how this has been set up to sort of guide the process. And it's kind of cool because it's color-coded by that allows you to track particular activities across the different areas, as well as filling in the strengths and so forth. But again, we encourage you to systematize how you think about action planning. Again, what you'll notice across everything that we've covered and everything that Heather and I put into this content is this notion about the importance of effective leadership. And you'll see that everything that was covered up to this point had to do with being clear about where we're headed. It's all about improving the competence of the implementers. It's all about making sure that we organize the system called the school or district or state so that people can be successful in implementing whatever they're being asked to put in place. What we've learned, if people fail at implementation, it's not sustainable, and we lose our ability to institute change in the future. We've also learned that change occurs in phases, that it requires those drivers I mentioned earlier, and that it's something that the leadership team has to think about as a process. It's not one thing you do at the beginning of the year and revisit next year. It's something that actually happens on a regular schedule or regular cycle. And we take advantage and make sure we understand that we're trying to build local capacity. Because without that local capacity, the grant doesn't allow, it won't sustain the implementation efforts. And of course, the importance of data as a way to guide decisions. So up to this point, everything I've described for you has to do with the role of leadership on being able to build an action plan, to be able to identify practices and goals, and to be efficient with organizing the system in which it's being implemented. So before we go to questions, a couple lessons learned. One, what we've learned from effective leadership so far. Student outcomes is a big deal. You need to be able to identify practices that you're willing to bet your next month's salary on. You need to organize those practices along a continuum so that all kids are supported. Particularly important that you focus on fidelity of implementation. Most of the work that we're doing, most of you that are on this call, focusing on how do we help the adults do a better job, and that's about organizing systems. It's also about making sure you think in the long term. These grants are very, very helpful in being able to establish local capacity, but going to scale, making sure it lasts longer than the 90-day warranty is going to be an important part of the process. There are a number of tools out there that can guide you. This is for the newbies out there who are just getting started with establishing teams. We have some guidance, self-assessments that allow you to say, how well are we doing in building our teams? Here's another example of how to run a meeting. What we've learned also is that you can have the best team structure in place, best membership, but if the implementation of the operation of that team isn't efficient, we lose our impact. And there are a number of team process tools out there. If you think about some of the things that are happening within the larger network, there's a thing called TIPS, which is a problem-solving model with a number of important tools and videos that allow teams to operate more efficiently. Another example, this is the PBS team meeting problem-solving tool, again built around the TIPS process, focuses on problem identification, problem analysis, implementation, and evaluation. And the last tool I want to share with you, just to give you an idea about process, is that, and this is just one example, and we have a number of self-assessments that measure implementation, like the benchmarks for quality, like the school-wide evaluation tool, like the tiered framework inventory. We've got a number of tools that allow people to track how well the teams are operating. The team checklist is just one example and allows teams to be able to self-assess their progress. And what I want you to notice about this particular tool is on the right-hand side, it allows it to be a continuous monitoring tool and not just a static tool. And it covers teams, covers mostly Tier 1 in the implementation of the PBS multi-tiered behavior framework logic. And we encourage you to look at these because what it allows you to do is to see whether or not your leadership is being able to affect what's happening in the action plan. All right, so in the last 3 minutes, what I want to share with you is your homework tasks. And then when I get done with that, we'll open it up to questions. And I'll quickly scan the question list and see which ones we can try to address. And we'll kind of go from there. So next steps, and if I should have made this slide a different color just because it's so important. I think if you had to walk away with something, what we'd encourage you to do is take the content from the slideshow, take the content from the webinar, take the content from the websites, and we'd like to do a pretty thorough self-assessment. And the self-assessment has to do with checking at, do you know where you're headed? Do you know the kinds of outcomes? Do you know the kinds of things that you have to put in place, the things you need to put in place to get to certain places? Self-assess. We've learned the self-assessment, especially the systematic, that is organized around some of the tools that I've shared with you. It translates more productively into action plans that are actually doable. Second next step, we'd love for you to do a resource mapping task in which you take some time to say, what committees do we have in place? What programs do we have up on the shelf? What practices are currently being implemented? And do a internal self-assessment or evaluation about which ones can be dropped, which ones can be added, which ones can be merged. So where do we want to go? What do we have in place now, practices-wise? Third homework task, as a leadership team, as a leadership person, we'd love for you to just ask the question, to what degree have we organized our resources to enable the adults, the implementers of those practices, to do a good job? What are the organizational structures that are currently in place to support our efforts? What are the features of those members of that organization that allow this to happen? And what roles and responsibilities and functions are important to highlight in order for this to be translated from on paper into action? So where do we want to go? Outcomes. What are we going to use with kids? Practices. What kinds of systems need to be in place to support the adults? Fourth, given all that, how are we going to build a plan that says, here is where we're at now, and where are we going to go with this? To me, that's one of the most important outcomes of the leadership team's activities, is having a map or an action plan or a working plan that allows you to operationalize where you're going to put investments. And that's built around the PBS blueprint, which primarily has to do with policy and political support and evaluation and funding, and how do we make sure that we've got local expertise in our faculty and staff roles. So the implementation plan is actually the organization of the outcomes, practices, and systems, and puts together a 1, 3, 5, 10-year plan to how you're going to build capacity for the implementation. Many of you have school climate transformation grants or your Youth Form Cities grants or Project Aware grants, and you've got a window of time in which to do this work. You can maximize the use of your dollars, to maximize the impact of your efforts by organizing your leadership activities around some of these next steps. The last one has to do with data. I won't say a whole lot about this, and if you didn't see the evaluation webinar, we encourage you to go back to it, or make sure that you look at the some of the materials on some of the sites. But data are one of the most important things that we ask people to collect, but they're only as good as the decisions and the decision-making processes that are in place. When you look at data, we're most concerned about are the kids benefiting, and second of all, are we implementing the way we promised to implement. So your homework task is really to build an action plan or to evaluate your current action plan to make sure that you have outcomes that are clear, practices that are evidence-based, making sure the adults have the structures in place to do the work, and that you have a method by which you can evaluate what's going on. And I think if you highlight those things, you're going to be better, have better capacity for being able to maximize your use of your grant resources as well as your local resources. All right, I think I'm pretty close to on time. It's 10:46. I'm a little bit over. I'd love to spend the next probably 8 minutes or so. Is that right? 8 minutes or so answering questions or making giving comments about any of the points that you have in the question box. And I'm going to stop us about 2 minutes to the hour so that we can get some closing comments and some acknowledgments, and then we'll kind of go from there. So I'm looking at the question box. Ivan, I might need your help in being able to scroll through these because I think you have control over it. I don't seem to have control over the questions scrolling.
You should be able to, George, you should be able to click and drag the question box onto off the main menu, and then expand it. Mouse over the corner and then click and drag to expand the question box.
I'm just getting bells. It's not. I'm not getting any actions on that bar. Huh. So let me ask you, Ivan. What's one of the questions towards the end?
Okay, let me see.
Let's have you sample a couple.
Okay, I'd be happy to. Let's see. Please clarify other required teams beyond the district leadership team.
Great. Okay, good. That's a really good question. The question is, please clarify what are the teams that might, beyond just the district or state or school teams. So I'm going to give you a general answer first, and we'll give a more specific one. The first one is that the important part about leadership teaming is to establish a structure that I like to call being able to distribute leadership impact. What we've learned is that teams, the physical teams, the structures teams, really depend a whole lot on the size of the organization. If you're a school, for example, that has 27 students in it, the whole faculty might be the team. But if you're a high school with 2,300 students, you might have multiple teams to represent the school climate work. The big idea there, though, is that can that team structure or multiple teams be coordinated in a way that to maximize the outcome of school climate and student benefit? So, having said that, what we've typically described as having a state leadership team that focuses on the general topic of behavior. That team might have sub-teams based on different priorities. So school climate, it could be individual kid, it could be mental health, but there's one umbrella team that kind of coordinates and keeps track of all behavior initiatives within the state department or state structure. Now, having said that, they establish policy. That policy is transferred down to either counties or districts or i.e. Independent service districts or regional groups. Within that group, we're hoping that there's an entity or entities that allow the translation of the state policy into an action plan that would be driven next to the school level. Now, in the school level team, it could be organized around tiers. So, for example, in my wife's school, when she was principal, she had a school-wide team that kept track of all behavior initiatives and activities. But then she also had a sub-team that kept track of Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions because they were built around the functions of Tier 2 to Tier 1. So we'd much rather have teams be built around functions and outcomes rather than around names. We don't want to have a social skills committee that's separate from the character ed committee that's different than the second steps committee, that instead we want a committee that deals with social skills broadly, within which we have character ed, second steps, first steps, whatever they are, as a way of organizing the resources. So the cheating answer is to say there's probably no single kind of way to think about numbers of kinds of teams as much as saying how can we efficiently organize our resources to achieve certain functions to address certain priority outcomes. And at minimum, there's going to be a state-level team, a district regional team, a school team, within which there's going to be sub-teams to organize the implementation. Ivan, next question, please.
If a district is just getting started with a district-wide initiative, what is a reasonable time frame to expect for the leadership component of the district level to be established?
Okay, good. So the general answer first and a specific one. And the question has to do with, what kinds of expectations time-wise can we predict, expect, et cetera, for district-level team to become self-sufficient, for it to become sustainable, to be implemented, established in the beginning. So the cheating answer, the broad answer, of course, is first. It varies anywhere from showing up on the first day having a leadership team in place, it's ready to go, because they already have a structure in place to drive that. In some places, we've had some schools take at least a year just to build the capacity for a leadership team to be established and to operate, and that the action plan for the school, meaning the teachers, wasn't actually put in place until the team had established agreements and priorities. What we've learned from that, and I think it's true in a number of our states, is that many of our states will actually ask school teams and districts to commit to a one-year readiness year in which teams are established, commitments are acquired, agreements are put in place, and working structures and action plans are established. Now, again, there are some schools, some districts, and some states that already have some of those structures in place, and they build them and put them in place and they're ready to go. School Climate Transformation Grant is a good example because right now in some of our SEAs and LEAs, when they got the grant, they just went, they picked up the money and they went because they already had teams, structures in place. We have other LEAs, some schools, some states, where did not have any of those structures in place, and we're building them now. What's important about that message is that the PBIS Center resources and the Safe and Healthy Students project officers and others understand that, and they're very willing and able to be able to support an action plan from our end to be able to make that occur. Again, I think if you look at some of those readiness checklists, you'll identify some of the core features that identify a well-established team. If you look at some of the operational functions that are on some of those checklists, you'll see what it looks like to have a well-established team. So I guess I'm fudging a little bit, but what we've learned is that on the first day of training, when somebody shows up to a training event, we ask them to come as teams. Sometimes that's called a scouting team because they're still questioning why they're there. Other teams come, they have their iPads out, and they're ready to go. So it really does vary. But we try to characterize those in the commitment self-assessments as well as the readiness requirements. Short story, I think one of the best ways to answer that question is to be able to sit down with one of the resource people and say, or TA providers, and say, here's where we're at. Given that, how long should we expect to be able to set aside to get to this leadership team capacity? How about one more question, Ivan?
Okay. If everybody is free to interpret the TFI in their own way, it can lead to less fidelity. Will there be a guidebook or some kind of QA session?
Great question. So the question had to do with how do we ensure that the TFI or any tools are being used with the greatest degree of fidelity and accuracy. So first thing is the TFI, the Tiered Framework Inventory, is already available at the pbs.org site and also the PBS app site. You can get access to webinars, you can get access to manuals. One of the best ways is to connect with your local PBS resource person. They can tell you if there's something going on in the region or in the state with respect to training. I know that the PBS apps folks are getting ready to roll with some training webinars as well as some training events at different conferences, so that will become available. Having said that, for the TFI, that's also true for all the other tools. We have manuals, we have fidelity checklists, we have of those checklists. I really love the question because we want all School Climate Transformation Grant users or grantees to be very aware that the scores are only as good as our ability to use those tools well. Having said that, again, we also know that the outcomes of those tools are really not intended to evaluate good or bad. They're self-assessment to say, here's where we think we are. Given that, where do we want to go next? So yes, we want to maximize the fidelity or accuracy of the use of those tools, but also realize that the outcomes are really there for action planning, for taking a look at ourselves in a mirror, being able to say whether or not we've changed from time A to time B. So the question is really good. Many of those resources are available at the website. If you get stuck, please contact one of us because that's one of the major functions we serve, is to get you hooked up with the information you need to have. Looks like we probably should stop there, Ivan. I've got 10, 11, 3 more minutes before the hour. Is that what you have?
That's what I have.
Okay. If you can give, do I still have control over the screen?
You sure do.
Okay. Do you see now a picture of a conference?
I don't.
Well, then I don't have control yet. So it shows it working. How about now? Anything moving?
No, I'm not seeing the slides progress.
Okay, so I'll just tell you what they are and you can look at them if you have a hard copy in front of you. One is just a slide that describes the details for the October 22nd, 23rd PBIS Forum. That's particularly important for the School Climate Transformation recipients because on the 22nd, the day before the full conference, that's going to be our traditional required meeting of safe and healthy students, project officers, the PBIS partners, and the School Climate Transformation Grant representatives. So please put that on your calendar, and if you have questions about that, check with your project officers or us. Second, next picture I wanted to announcement I want to indicate was the March PBIS conference, APBS conference, the Positive Behavioral Support Conference. That's going to be in San Francisco on March 23rd and 26th. The reason I want to mention that is because this year we had a pre-conference workshop that was optional, and we also had a number of sessions where School Climate Transformation Grant recipients participated. And the feedback was really good about how they benefited from seeing other implementers of multi-tiered behavioral frameworks. And the almost last slide was a picture that listed the upcoming webinars. April 23rd is the implementation action planning, where Tim Lewis will go into greater depth into action planning. And on May 28th, is Susan Barrett and Lucille Eber will do one on building training and coaching capacity. That will be the last webinar for the spring. We take a break during the summer, and then we'll have a full agenda of webinars starting in, I believe it's either August or September. But you'll be able to see all that if you go to the School Climate Transformation click at pbs.org, and all those events will be listed there. And with that, I just want to end with saying Heather George, who regrets not being part of this, is always available if you want to contact her. for email is on the slideshow as well as on the website. And you can always contact me if you have questions about this as well. Everything, the recording of the webinar as well as the PowerPoint and future events is going to be located at pbs.org. And really do thank you for spending your time with us this morning, or I guess it's now afternoon. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to connect with your School Climate Transformation Grant project officers or with the PBS partners or any of us at the center. So thank you very much. I want to thank Ivan for helping me, and we apologize to you out there who are having to suffer through some of the glitches that I had at my end. But I think the content should be fairly accessible to you. So again, thank you. Have a good rest of the day, and good luck with your implementation effort.